Deploying software updates. Okay, if you're joining us now after getting off the last nugget where we talked about operating system deployment, you're probably wiping your brow at this point because the operating system deployment was relatively complex and all the bits and pieces you needed to link together to make it function. And the good news is that here within software updates, the whole process gets a lot easier. And so unlike OSD, which was somewhat challenging, I think you'll find in this nugget that the process of deploying software updates is relatively easy to put together. And now if you're familiar with SMS 2003, if you're familiar with actually trying to deploy software updates with SMS 2003, you probably remember that actually deploying software updates with SMS was in some ways almost harder than deploying them through WSUS. And so Microsoft has really taken this to heart. And in Configuration Manager 2007, software updates actually is much, much easier to use, much easier to manage. And part of that is because software updates now links with WSUS. And for us to be able to use software updates, we need to install WSUS onto our Configuration Manager server because the software updates site role that we'll also talk about needs to work with that WSUS installation to essentially pull down those files, pull down that metadata, and then use Configuration Manager to actually manage and process that. We're going to talk about that WSUS installation component. We're going to talk about the client agent for software updates and the site role as well and how those linkages occur. And then once we understand that, we're going to talk about deployment templates and deployment packages, which are the ways that you will actually define how your updates get pushed down to computers and what updates get pushed down to computers. And all this takes us into the whole process of updating computers themselves and ultimately reporting on those updates. And now before we can actually go in and start talking about the Configuration Manager portion of software updates, we actually need to talk a little bit about the WSUS component, because Configuration Manager actually leans on WSUS and the WSUS server in order for it to handle updating the list of metadata, pulling all the patches down from Microsoft. Really, instead of trying to build their own software updates components like they did back in SMS 2003, Configuration Management leans on that already existing rich functionality that you have in WSUS. Now, WSUS itself has, I will say, some limitations in how it can be managed. You have you lean on organizational units and the deployment of group policy for it to successfully deploy patches out to machines. And so, in some very complex environments or environments where you have multiple needs, that can be somewhat challenging. And so, having a Configuration Manager be able to do multiple different deployment templates allows you a little bit more flexibility in how you push out your patches. Now, that being said, this is the WSUS 3.0 SP1 setup wizard, and in this setup wizard, really, we need to go through the process of setting up WSUS just like we would if this were a straight WSUS server. We need a full server installation, including the administration console. It's going to install those components. We accept the terms of the license agreement here, and we can choose to store those updates locally, or if we don't want to store those updates locally, we can choose to store those updates at Microsoft and have our machines go to Microsoft to deploy those updates as we see fit. That's really an architectural decision that you need to make in your environment where you want to store your updates. Now, be aware that if you do decide to store those updates locally, just like with WSUS, you need to have a pretty decent amount of disk space here. This says 6 gigabytes, but that's really a very minimal amount of disk space. You need to have substantially more than that to be able to store the vast catalog of updates that you'll be pulling down through the WSUS infrastructure. In this case, we'll store those updates locally here in the C drive and CWSUS. We can choose to install either the Windows internal database, we can use an existing database server. We have a database server here already on this system if we want, or we can use an existing database server on another computer as well. In this case, it's just easier to use the Windows internal database, so we'll use that Windows internal database also located here within CWSUS. Now, what's very, very important when you go through this installation process is that the Configuration Manager components actually make use of IIS by default for their own functionality. And if you actually use WSUS in the default website, you may have some problems with the functionality of your Configuration Manager instance. And so it's a good idea for you to create a separate WSUS 3.0 site for the processing of the WSUS components, as opposed to using the default website in this case. And by doing this, you are effectively changing the port number for where you're going to for WSUS information from the default of port 80 to this alternate site, which is port 8530. Now, when you do this, it's very, very important that you also write down what the extra port number is because when you're going through the other half, the Configuration Manager half of this, it's going to ask you what this port number is so that it can connect with the WSUS infrastructure. The rest of the installation is relatively trivial. If you've done a WSS installation before, this is exactly the same as a standard WSS installation. There's really no different. So at this point, it's going to actually complete the process of installing WSS SP1, 3.0 SP1. Once this completes, what we're going to do then is sort of take over the management of that WSS installation from the configuration manager side. And so even though WSS has its own integration, its own management consoles, we are going to actually use Configuration Manager to manage the settings of that WSS service. So what I'm going to do now is pause the recording while we wait for this to complete installing, and when we come back, we'll be at the Configuration Manager console where we can continue the installation. Okay, and we're back. We've now at this point actually completed the installation of the core bits of WSS, and really it was sort of a default installation except for that one setting that uses the alternate site for WSS instead of the standard default IIS website. And once we've done that, we actually then come into Configuration Manager and actually complete the installation of the configuration here inside of the Configuration Manager console. Here under Site Management, there are actually two places that we need to just verify to make sure that the configuration is done correctly. The first of which is here under Client Agents. We want to look at the Software Updates Client Agent. If we double click this here, it's going to bring up the properties for the Software Updates Client Agent. We've already talked about this before, but by default, the Software Updates Client Agent does enable software updates on clients. So the clients that we currently have in our Configuration Manager infrastructure, by default, are already available and have the policy set so that they will actually enable software updates when we have this checkbox. But if you had your Configuration Manager instance out for any period of time, you may have unchecked this box. You want to make sure that you've actually have this box checked so that you'll actually make use of software updates. Under the update installation here, we can choose if we want to enforce all mandatory deployments. This is actually a good case if you have a situation, a very lockdown situation or a very high risk situation where when you create mandatory deployments, you want to ensure that all of those mandatory deployments actually deploy as they as you set them inside of the schedule. The other thing that this does is if you have multiple different deployments that are scheduled for being deployed at a particular period of time, once you create a mandatory deployment, those other deployments with those future deadlines are also going to actually occur all at once. This helps reduce the amount of reboots that are required. It reduces the spread of time that's required to get all the patches installed. And so this is really a good checkbox. Again, if you have one of those environments, you want to do a better job of enforcing when those deployments occur. Down here on the bottom, too, we have another checkbox that instructs the clients to hide the deployment components, the notifications from those end users. And now this is going to be, again, an architectural decision inside of your environment. If you have users that want to be notified whenever software is being deployed down to them, whenever software updates are being deployed down to them, then you can uncheck this box. But in a lot of environments, we don't want our users necessarily to be aware that they're being patched. We just want them to go and do their job and just assume that we're doing all the work for them in the back end. So depending on what your environment is and what the expectation of your user set is will determine how you check this box here as well. Under deployment reevaluation, this is effectively a setting that tells the clients what interval to use to go back and recheck to see if updates have actually installed. If you've used WSS before, you're probably aware of some of the problems with WSS. When you have patches that don't take, for lack of a better word, when those patches don't take, we need to actually go back and instruct the client to go and reevaluate its status and redeploy patches to itself if those patches aren't being shown up as actually being successfully installed. And so what this deployment reevaluation does is it tells that client, go back and recheck yourself, and if there are any patches that you should have that you don't, go ahead and go through the process again of actually downloading and installing them. Now you'll see here that we can change the days just within here in deployment reevaluation and also with the update installation here as well. We can change the number of days that we want to actually go through these processes. And 7 days when you consider high environments and high risk environments and really some of the criticality of patches these days, 7 days can actually be a very long period of time. So you may consider actually reducing this value down to a number of days or even a number of hours in the case of update installation to just reduce the amount of time that it takes actually for you to go from 0% compliant to 100% compliant inside of your infrastructure. Once you're done here, you can actually hit the OK button, and that completes the installation and the configuration of the client agent. The other piece that has to occur for us to complete the initial configuration of our software updates is here under Site Systems. Now, we've already slowly been adding more and more features and functionality to our sccm Nugget server. We're going to add one more role here by right-clicking and choosing New Roles. What we want to do this time is install the software update point role here. The software update point role is what actually connects Configuration Manager to that WSS instance for it to be able to do what it needs to. Now, I need to stop there, actually, because there are some instances where you may not have the WSS server on the same server as your site system. And in those cases, you do need to have some components installed to the site server for it to be able to communicate with the WSS instance. And those components are the administration console. As you know, if you install the WSS components onto a particular server, you have the choice to install either all of the stuff, the entire server components and everything to that server, or just the administration console. And in the case where you already have a WSS server already in your environment and you don't want to migrate and don't want to move it, you do need to get that administration console installed to the site server that will be the software update point for it to function correctly. You'll see here that when we hit the next button, we have a few configurations that we need to set. If we have a proxy server in our environment that we need to use to get outbound, to get out to the internet, to pull those patches down and that metadata down, we can choose a proxy server here. In this case, we don't have one in this environment. If we choose next, then we actually enable using this server as the active software update point for our environment. Now, you'll see here that there are specific port settings that are used to connecting to the WSS server. And as we talked about during the WSS installation component, we actually needed to write down those port numbers. Well, the port numbers by default that are used are port numbers 8530 for the regular port number, and the SSL port number is 8531. If we use those port numbers, then WSS will be able to, Configuration Manager will be able to directly connect to WSS when it's using that alternate port. I'm going to click Next here, and that brings us to the synchronization source. When we are making these configurations at this point, these configurations are flowing through Configuration Manager and over into WSS. And so at this point, we are actually doing the configuration here, and it will take care of, on our behalf, updating WSS correctly. You'll see here before we talked about where we wanted to synchronize. Do we synchronize from Microsoft Update, or do we synchronize from an upstream server? If we have multiple servers in our organization, we may want to, instead of having them all synchronized from Microsoft Update, we may just have them synchronized from a single upstream update server. This environment only has one server, so we will synchronize from Microsoft Update here. We have the option of the agents on those client computers of creating specific types of reports. We can create no reports, status reports, or all reports. In our case, we want to have all reports in this installation so that we can view what's going on the clients. We want to know what sort of status is going on the clients when they're achieving successes and when they're achieving failures. The next button here takes us over to the synchronization schedule, and by default, this is not enabled, but it's a good idea for us to enable that synchronization on a schedule, because this is the process whereby the WSS server goes up to Microsoft to go look and see if there are any other updates that have changed, any other new ones that are available for pulling down and pulling the metadata down as well. If we don't do this, we need to manually go and complete the synchronization on behalf of the WSS server. And so we can run a simple schedule here. A good thing to do here is run that simple schedule perhaps once a day, so that if Microsoft makes some changes to available patches, that we'll get those on an everyday basis. This is a relatively low resource use functionality, so changing this from 7 days to 1 day is not really going to impact the environment all that much. The next one here is involved with which of the updates we actually want to download. And this and the next two elements can actually significantly change the amount of data storage space that we're going to need in order to support the type of updates we want to keep. You'll see here that there are a lot of different types of updates available that Microsoft actually produces. By default, we're choosing security updates, service packs, and update roll-ups. We may want to add in feature packs, for example, or critical updates, for example, for the different types of classifications that are available to us, or even things like drivers, for example. We have to be careful, and again, this is another one of those architectural things that you're going to want to think about whenever you're preparing for this, is what types of updates do you plan to deploy to your clients? If you're not going to be deploying certain types of updates, then you don't necessarily want to pull them down from Microsoft to your local instance. The same thing goes for products. This is the list of products available through Microsoft, and if you don't plan on patching those products, then it's probably a good idea not to bring them down, because all it does is clutter up your database. So be very conscious about the different products that are available to you that are important for your environment to actually download. In this case, we'll download Windows, we'll download Office. We can also update this product list as necessary at a later point in time. Most importantly, though, are the types of languages that you actually want to download. If you are not supporting languages in your environment that are listed here by default, then you don't want to pull down those patches because they can significantly increase the amount of space that you have to have locally for patches that you never intend to deploy. In this case, we may only be using the English language, and we may only have Windows deployed in the English language, so we can safely remove the checkboxes for all of the other languages here because we don't need to include those languages as part of those that we're going to be either downloading or actually deploying to our clients. You'll see here there are a pretty large number of available languages that are installed by default. And again, you don't want to have to pull those down and manage those patches if you're not planning on deploying them. When we hit next here, it brings us to a summary page that instructs us what essentially the selections we've chosen. Choose next again, and it's going to begin that process of configuring the WSS server. We see the green check here, which shows that that new site role wizard is completed successfully, and now we are ready to use this site server as a software update point. Now that we've completed our initial configuration of software updates, we actually need to go down and complete a synchronization to see what sort of patches we have available. If I scroll down here, this is the software update node, and you'll see update repository here. This is the repository of all the available updates that have been brought down and synchronized from Microsoft. If I right click and choose run synchronization, it's going to begin the process of synchronizing our local instance here with the update repository up at Microsoft. You'll see here that we can view the process of the synchronization through the SMS WSS Sync Manager component within component status. If we choose yes here, it's going to begin that process of going up to Microsoft, asking Microsoft for what sort of updates are available, and downloading specifically the metadata associated with the products and the type of updates and the languages that we've selected. This process can actually take a period of time. And once it completes, we'll actually have here within our update repository a list of all the available updates that we can potentially install to our clients. So I'm going to pause the recording here, and when we come back, this update repository will be filled with the available updates that we have. And we're back. And actually, this the synchronization process, the very first time you do it, can actually take a substantial amount of time. The time elapsed between stopping the recording and starting was, at this point, about an hour and a half, and it's still just about done completing with the synchronization from Microsoft and then ingesting it from the WSS database into the configuration manager database. But you can see here now that the update repository now has a number of additional types of updates that weren't there before that are now available. You can see we have critical updates and WSS updates and security updates, those sorts of things. If we scroll down and look at, for example, critical updates that are available, in this case we can look at all critical updates, you'll see now that we have a number of updates that are available to us. Here's we have Microsoft updates. We can break it down even further for an Office 2003, 2007, etc. We have the title of the update. We have what percentage compliance we have also for the clients that are currently attached into our configuration manager infrastructure. And so you're looking here, we can see how many clients we have that currently have the update installed, how many clients require that update to be installed, how many clients don't really care, and how many clients do we not really know, which are unknown, and then total, for example. In this case, we don't have any clients that are really particularly interested in this particular update, but you can see there's quite a bit amount of data that's available to us for each of the individual updates that we could potentially take a look at here inside of our update repository. Now, one thing you may be thinking when we were going back and taking a look at the initial configuration for Update Manager is that we had a very limited sense of the types of categories that were available to us. Now, those categories actually update from time to time, and a place that we can go to change what categories we actually want to pull down from Microsoft is here under Component Configuration. You'll see now we have the Software Update Point component that's available to us. If we double-click this, we can view the properties of that component. And here in the properties of that component, we can change our general settings, we can change our synchronization settings if we need to, and we can also change the classifications and products. Now, one thing you'll notice is how much larger this product list was than when it was before. We've actually updated not only the updates that are available to us, but also the individual products that we can download as part of the synchronization component. This is just the same thing as is done inside of WSS as well. So before we only had Office 2002 and 2003, now we actually have Office 2007. And down here here we had Windows 2000 and XP, but now we're adding in all the Vista editions as well. So you can see over time as just like in WSUS, as Configuration Manager goes and does its updates, it's going to update the available products for you as well. So you will need to, from time to time, go in here and select additional products that you see necessary to begin updating inside of your environment. So this is the software update point component properties, and that's again here under component configuration. There are a couple of things that we need to do to begin the process of deploying updates to our available clients. The first thing we need to do is down here under deployment templates. What this is going to do is create more or less a template that instructs the clients that are assigned this template how they will be processing their client updates. And so we may have a couple of different templates. We may have a standard template which says that clients can update within 5 days, and that there are certain events that are associated and certain restart settings that are associated with this template. And then we may have, for example, an emergency or a high priority template also, which really restricts the amount of time that the clients have to be able to do that update. Maybe we have a very, very high priority patch and we don't care if it reboots machines in the middle of the day. We just want that template or that patch to get installed as fast as possible. So let's say we want to create a standard template here. We'll call it standard template. And then we go through the wizard here, and it allows us some settings for how we want to configure the settings for this particular template. First of all, we select a collection to use to deploy for software update deployment. In this case, we can choose the browse button here and look for our available collections. Maybe we want to send this standard template to the all systems collection, or maybe even better yet, the all workstations collections. For example, all Windows workstation or professional systems. So in this case, we are deploying applications and deploying patches not to our servers, but just to our workstations or professional systems, the desktop systems. We click next here. We can allow display notifications on client, or perhaps suppress those notifications. Maybe on the servers we want to allow, but on the workstations we want to suppress. If we have multiple time zones in our domain or in our configuration manager infrastructure, we can choose to use UTC, but if we're all in one location, we may want to choose client local time for the determination of those deployment schedules. And then also, when the template is used to create a deployment, what is the deadline used to set an upper bound on the amount of time that we are allowing for those updates to get deployed. Here under restarts, we can actually prevent restarts for servers or for workstations. If we have an update that requires a restart, but we don't want that to, for example, update our servers or accidentally restart our servers, we can check the box here to protect those. We can also down here allow system restart outside of those maintenance windows. We're going to talk about maintenance windows in just a second, but really if we have a maintenance window set up of a particular time of the day that we can do a system restart, if we have, for example, a high priority template that we want to create that we need to deploy those patches very, very fast, we may want to check this box so that we will go ahead and complete that restart notwithstanding of the available maintenance window. We can click next here. Do we want to suppress events that may occur for Operations Manager while software updates run? In some cases, when software updates run, it's going to reboot the system. It's going to be doing things that actually pops a lot of messages to the event log. And in this case, we may not want Operations Manager to show that as being a problem. However, we may want Operations Managers to alert when update installation actually fails on any particular client. We can choose the download settings as well. Do we want to not install software updates or install software updates if we are on what we consider a slow or unreliable network? Each boundary has an option of being chosen as a fast network or a slow or unreliable network. In the case where those are slow or unreliable networks, do we care? Do we want software updates to just pass by? Or do we actually want to download those updates anyway? Same thing here is if our clients are outside of their distribution points, outside of their boundaries, do we want them to go and find updates from an unprotected distribution point outside of their boundaries if necessary? Again, this is going to have a lot to do with the type of template that you're trying to create. We click next here. If we have SMS 2003 clients in our environment, those have different mechanisms by which they deploy updates. And if we have those clients in our environment, we can choose those characteristics here. In our environment, we don't have any clients, so we can safely unselect this. We click next, and it gives us a summary page associated with all the settings that we've set up in this environment to this point for this template. You'll see here's the deployment template summary of everything we've created, and it'll actually create the template at this point. This template is the structure that defines how those patches will get deployed to systems. Once we've created that structure, the next step is actually to identify the updates or the patches that we want to deploy using that structure. Now if we go back up here, you'll see the number of updates we have in our repository. And if we take a look at, let's take a look at Windows XP updates. You see if we click on Windows XP updates, we get a list of all the available updates that we have that relate to Windows XP. And as we saw before, there's a lot of additional data here that's related to those updates as well. If we see a particular update that is of use to us, an update that we know that we want to deploy, or even if we have multiple updates that we know we want to deploy, we can select those updates here within the interface and add those updates into what we call an update list. Once we have the list of updates that we know we want to add into an update list, we can right-click the selection and choose Update List. In this case, what we're doing is we're creating a list of updates that we're going to deploy through a deployment of software updates. So in this case, let's actually create a new update list. In this update list, we'll say Update List. It has a name here and also a date and a time and maybe a description associated with it. If we want, we can begin the process of downloading the files associated with those selected software updates. If we're going to be deploying those software updates and we're going to be deploying them from a central location, in other words, we are downloading the content to our local workstation, we're going to need to choose this box to actually download the content for those files to our local workstation. When we create that update list, the next thing we're going to do is actually create a deployment package. And so what we've done now is we have a template that defines how the updates will be deployed. We have a list of the updates that we want to deploy, and now we have a package which is essentially the mechanism by which they get deployed. So in this case, let's assume that perhaps this is our April monthly patches that we need to update. So we can call it in here April monthly patches. We give it a description if we want. We can give package source information if we want as well. We actually already have a package source location that we've created before this time. If we go to C source files, this is the location where we've been storing our OSD images and also our Acrobat 8 for a standard application deployment. In our case, we may want to create another subfolder called updates. Let's create this updates folder here. We're going to create this folder called updates, and then from the interface, we're going to connect to that package source location, sccm nugget source files, and then from there, we're going to do updates. This actually stores that location, or those files, in this updates location for us. We click OK, and we can choose the sending priority if we want and enable binary differential replication if we have multiple locations where this needs to replicate across and we want to reduce the amount of replication traffic involved. We choose Next. This allows us to update distribution points and what sorts of distribution points will be used to host this deployment package file. If we click the Browse button here, it allows us to choose what available distribution points we want to update that include the source files for deploying this package. Remember, this is the same process that we used back when we were deploying applications, but in this case we're deploying software updates. And with any sort of deployment, we have to update that distribution point with the information from the package source location. We choose Next. We now have a download location. We can download those software updates from the net, or we can download the software updates from a location on the local network. Now this situation is useful in the case where you have a configuration manager server in an off-net environment. Maybe you've got a classified environment or an environment that has an air gap between it and the rest of the internet. In those cases, you could actually download the software updates from the internet and then use the sneakernet method, burning it to a DVD and copying it to a location on the local network to actually get those software updates into your infrastructure. This particular one actually is connected to the internet, so we can download those software updates directly from the internet. We can choose the language selection. Of the languages that we have available to us, which sorts of languages do we actually want to download the files in? In our case, we only want to choose English as the language that we download the files in because we don't have additional languages available in our environment. So we want to minimize the amount of downloads that we have to bring down to our local server because we only have this language available to us. We click Next. We go through the security prompt. After the security prompt, we have a summary prompt where we more or less learn all the settings that we set up before, and we choose the next screen. If we've done everything correctly, it will begin the process of downloading and creating those packages for us, and if we get the green checkbox, then we'll know we've done everything successfully. Okay, at this point we see that the update list wizard has actually completed successfully. Again, we have the necessary green checks, so we know that we've been successful in all of these bits. And so what we've done at this point is we've created an update list, and this update list includes the information that we want about those patches. This update list is then used to create a package and a program that are used to deploy those patches to the servers that we want. Once we're actually ready to deploy the patches, we actually need to deploy software updates by right-clicking the update list that we created and choosing Deploy Software Updates. updates. And this brings all of those pieces together so that we can actually go and do that change event like we're looking to do in the creation of all these bits. Now you'll see here that we've got this deploy software updates wizard. We can give it a name, or we can use the default name that we have in here, and we choose next. And then now, this is very different than what we saw inside of SMS 2003. This is the linkage between the software updates, the update list that we created, and now the template that we created in the early part of this nugget. You'll see here there's a standard template, includes some details about where we're going to deploy to, the user notification, system restart, those sorts of things. Or we can create a new deployment definition if we want here within the wizard. In our case, we've already created that standard template, so we can use the existing template and click next. And then we can choose the schedule that we want to deploy those updates on. Do we want to deploy them now, or do we want to deploy them at a point in the future? Do we want to set a deadline for them to actually complete? Or if we don't want to set a deadline, we can choose this box, or actually choose at what point will those software updates be installed. If we have Wake on LAN, we can enable Wake on LAN, and we can in those instances where we want to deploy really quickly, we can actually ignore the maintenance window and install immediately at the deadline. If we click next here, you'll see the summary screen and then the progress screen. This will actually create the package and the program for deploying software updates. Scroll down here, we see the green checkbox, and we click close. Now if I go up to my software distribution node and open up packages, you'll see, well, wait a minute, there's no packages there. There's no, what we just did doesn't seem to appear. And that's because these packages and programs that we're creating using software updates don't actually get distributed through the typical software distribution node. And that's how it was back in SMS 2003. Here within Configuration Manager, we have this node called Deployment Management. And under Deployment Management is the location where that package and program are more or less being created. You'll see here that we have Microsoft Updates. This is the deployment ID that we've created, as well as the when it's available and when the deadline is for it. If we right-click, we can choose the properties and see all of the various settings that we have associated with deploying those patches to the collection that we're interested in case this is the Windows Workstation Professional Systems collection that we have, the updates that are available, the SMS 2003 settings, whatever schedule, all of the settings that are related to actually deploying this package and program for these updates. And so this is really the process that we're going to use to actually deploy updates using Configuration Manager software updates. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the process of deploying software updates and all the, again, just like with OS deployment, all the pieces that have to fit together for a software updates situation to occur. And remember, the reason why we have these sort of multiple pieces that fit together is that it allows you this ability to create multiple schedules, to create multiple packages of updates, to create multiple templates that define how you want those updates installed to your clients. We talked about the WSUS installation and how that links into the software updates client agent and also the client role and the site role. We talked about deployment templates and also deployment packages that are used to define how we want to deploy those packages and deploy those updates to our clients. And then we talked about the process of updating computers and how it's just subtly different than the process to actually send application updates to those clients. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.